here. Again, this kind of gives a breakdown over the 20-year period, 6,000 additional residents. Housing is not very affordable, and that's something that really is the key here. And what the city has control over really is product type. We cannot really control price point, but what we can control is what is needed over time. And of the 1,873 housing units, and there's about 412 in pipeline, what we would consider pipeline. Then moving forward, for the 1,873 units, there's about 30% are needed in standard lots, about 32% in smaller lots and cottages, 19% in townhomes and plexes, and 19% in apartments and multifamily. Housing production strategies, again, are items that we've talked about briefly with you all on Planning Commission and City Council. They are promoting the development of needed housing, the identified tools and policies that we'll be looking at in the future. Those would be strategies, or what we're anticipating is in 2025, starting in the fall, we would be doing a full-on code update of the entire code, and we would look at those strategies in light of the code update. There'll be advisory committees for that, et cetera. This will be probably a two-year process, roughly, is my expectation, to go through and update the code, looking at the deficiencies of the code first, and then doing the update of the overall code. It needs an overhaul, and it'll be not only the strategies, but other parts of the code. Again, the strategies are implemented over a 5 to 8 year period. They can be adjusted, and that's something we'll talk about at the next hearing. That's something that can be adjusted over time with the LCD, but it's basically a guideline for us moving forward. Housing efficiency measures, again, cottage cluster and revised planning and development, that's what we're focusing on tonight. And this went through the advisory committee process. I know this has been a long journey involved here. We did have state grants for this work, so virtually all of it was paid for with those grants. But I know it's been a long journey getting to this point. Part of that is just the nature of this process and how we've had to work through the state process. But we're required to show efficiency measures. They're critical for a couple reasons. One is they look at our ability to accommodate land without having to do an urban growth boundary expansion. There are ways to basically address that. But even with these items, there's still a need for an urban growth boundary expansion of about 74 acres. And that's the expansion area that's in the housing needs analysis. But the housing efficiency measures are critical, because if we don't adopt them, we cannot do an urban growth boundary expansion, thus we cannot expand the urban growth boundary. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica and run through everything else, and there'll be a chance, but I hope that framework was somewhat helpful in the context here of at least why are we here tonight, what's coming, and what items are not being discussed tonight.
Thank you, Director Hardy. Good evening, Commissioners. Nice to see you all again. Quick moment here just to lay out what we're going to talk about this evening. Director Hardy did a great job of summarizing, but again, we're going to talk through the Cottage Cluster Development Code, which is a new code for the City of Canby. We're going to go over the minor revisions we have to both permitted uses and standards in the R1 and R15 base zones, and talk a little bit about PUD code and what we're proposing to change as part of this efficiency effort. A couple things we're not going to talk about tonight. C2 zone, which is not on this slide, but I thought I would bring it up. We spent a lot of time last work session talking about potential code changes to the C2 district. We are not pursuing that any longer. So you didn't see it in your packet, and you won't see it tonight as we talk through the changes. A couple of other things we wanted to point out. Nothing in the proposed packet will affect multifamily in the R2 district. That's a totally separate effort. And there's nothing in the updates that would affect street design standards. So no skinny street proposal here tonight, just talking about what happens on site related to different housing product types. So just setting the stage a little bit here. You did get a full update. Feel free to leave it there. Nope, you're good. You did get a full update of the annotated code. What we're trying to do tonight, since we've talked about this a few times, is just highlight the changes rather than go line by line, although we can get into that if there are particular questions. So feel free to stop me if you want or have questions as we work through this. All right, so starting with cottage clusters. Quick overview of what we are proposing to change. So as I mentioned, this is a new housing product type. We are proposing that it be permitted outright in both the R1 and the R15 zones within the city. We are proposing specific and discrete standards for the cottage clusters. So in general, these standards are intended to supersede the existing code. There are a couple of instances where they correlate. One example is the front yard setback. If you'll notice in the draft code, we recommend that it fall under follow the base zone where it comes to front yard setbacks. That was purposeful to align with the Planning Commission's preference that we make sure these integrate and feel the same as you're driving along a streetscape, but you don't notice the difference between a single-family detached unit that was built and designed on its own, and then as you transition to cottage clusters. So you see that continuity within the zones. A couple of other things I wanted to touch here is we are proposing that cottage clusters are reviewed as a type 3 site design review process. They can also be looked at through a planned unit development proposal. If they are proposed as a subdivision, they'd go through the land division standards as well and be subject to those. There is an instance, though, where this cottage cluster could be on an individual lot of record, so that's where you see that site design review process prevail there. We are also recommending that cottage clusters have a minimum density of 6 units per acre. There isn't a maximum density identified right now, provided that you comply with all the design and development standards that are proposed in the code. I'll pause there because that was a lot. Any questions for the moment? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Can you remind me on the type 3 approval process? Can you walk us through that process? What interaction?
So the Planning Commission will have authority over the review process. There was discussion previously with the Planning Commission, and there was a strong feeling that you all wanted to be part of that discussion process.
Okay.
There's not a bright line yet in Oregon to say that this cannot be a type 3. Our counsel's on the line. David can talk a bit about that if he needs to, but I think the gist of it is most jurisdictions have either done a type 1 or 2 for cottage clusters, but there's nothing in state law that says we can't do a type 3.
Very well. Thank you.
I have a question. It's just my ignorance. I'm just trying to learn all this. But when we allow this, where's the incentive for a developer to do anything but this high-density stuff? I mean, are we focusing so much on this that we're going to lose our way with the low-density stuff? I'm very worried with the amount of acres that we're bringing in here. This town the people in this town won't recognize it in 10 years with all this high density like this. What's the incentive going to be to do the low density to a developer?
Really, I mean, we're charged here, I'm just going to be pretty blunt, we're charged with accommodating all income levels, and that's really what we're charged with doing. Whether I have a preference for everything to remain single-family detached lots, that state doesn't really recognize that, essentially. And so we're looking at the population and what the housing income levels are that folks could afford, and having to look at ways to provide tools. Now, one thing I would say, though, this is a voluntary process, and so is the planned unit development process. We're not mandating this on anybody. It's totally a voluntary tool to allow that. And so it's an incentive, basically. We're not saying you shall do this. If you want to do it, that's great. If you want to do traditional development, go for it. That's up to you. So there's nothing that would preclude traditional development. So we're really not precluding that at the same time. But I think that really the gist of it is that we know what the demographics are. It was adopted in our housing needs analysis. We know what the population needs are. Housing is unaffordable, and therefore we have to make some concerted effort to try to address that.
So is it fair to say that market conditions obviously are going to play a factor, and like you said, it's not mandated, but it's available and we cover it should a developer decide to pursue it based on market conditions?
Absolutely. And right now, nothing's being built. I mean, the housing prices are out of control. I mean, it's just everywhere. It's starting to come back, but I mean, it's not like, there's this competition for, you're doing detached single-family large lots aren't being built.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's obviously there's a price point that has to settle a bit. I think interest rates will hopefully help the housing to come back. So, but yeah, absolutely, it's a voluntary, incentivized item that we need to do to address the ability to provide that tool that's available in the toolbox as it's not currently available.
So, but you say it's not mandated, which I don't think it's mandated from you, but it's clearly mandated from the state, is it not?
The state is mandating that we allow for tools that allow for higher density, single-family, there's higher density, there's still single-family. What we're talking about tonight is really single-family, primarily single-family detached, clearly single-family detached and cottage cluster that are detached. They're smaller lots, but yeah, they're still single-family detached. So it's a tool that is used. I mean, is it beneficial to the community? It's somewhat of a value judgment on that. It's probably beneficial to those people that can afford that house versus those that can't afford anything. And so I think the long run of it is you're providing some incentive, provide a diversified housing portfolio. I think there's a demographic that has an implication here as well, personally, that if everything is unaffordable, what does this community look like in 20 years as well? There's another factor that plays into this as well. You know, are there going to be school kids, et cetera, in the community?
Thank you.
All right, you want to advance
Yeah.
this thing? Thank you. Right. Oh, there it goes. Okay, good. So what you're seeing here on screen, this diagram is a new diagram. It was included in your packet, but it has been created since the last time we met. And you'll notice that it's got some specific standards that tie to the code language. So we have essentially modified and created a diagram that helps illustrate what the standards expect. And again, we can just kind of highlight a few of these here. I won't painstakingly read through all of them, but a couple things I wanted to point out on this slide. So you'll see kind of this landscape area around the perimeter of the parking lot. So we're showing a requirement for landscape buffers adjacent to streets and adjacent to residential lots. So you can envision that there is a residential lot on the other side of that lot line there. So we're proposing landscaping to buffer that combined parking. You'll see there's pedestrian walkways through the center of the site to connect all of the cottages to not only the courtyard in the center there, which is that prominent characteristic and feature of a cluster where you see that open space that's shared, but also ties to that parking, that shared parking area, and also gets you out to the front of the site where you would expect to see sidewalk and the public street. Other couple things to note here on the plan is that you do see what looks like a shared driveway on the right-hand side. That's showing an alternate way in which parking can be accommodated in the cluster. So the code provisions allow for different ways for you to achieve parking on site. It can be in that shared parking area like you see on the left, or could be through private driveways leading to garages or either detached or attached garages, or it could be a combination. So providing some flexibility for developers to design their cluster in a way that makes sense based on market demand and buyer preferences. So good flexibility in that. Couple other things I'll call out is just you'll see letter F there on the front, that is a front yard setback. And again, that ties to that special standard that says it defers to the underlying zone for front yard setback. Again, providing that opportunity for variability if something changes over time, making sure it stays consistent with the underlying zone for continuity's sake. I think that is everything. Here is another kind of summary slide here and another graphic that was produced for the code. This is more illustrative in nature. It's three-dimensional to provide a little bit of perspective here. A few additional items about the design standards. So we are proposing minimum square footage of 600 square feet and a maximum square footage of 1,200 square feet. Again, the idea behind that is really to provide kind of bookends for this alternate housing product type. It's not intended to be single-family detached necessarily, or your traditional view of it. It's meant to be these smaller units, which will, in theory, provide some diversity in housing product type throughout the community. So we do have bookends on those sizes. They're generally oriented around the cluster, or the courtyard, which is, of course, that prominent feature at the center, which is highlighted in green. Again, the idea that there is really to create a bit of a community in the cluster, so trying to create that by requiring a certain number of the cottages to be adjacent to the unit, or to the courtyard.
Jessica, Commissioner Ewert has a question.
Oh, sorry,
Commissioner
yes.
Ewert, please. Commissioner Ewert, I think you might be on mute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So I hear everything that's been said up to this point. I am looking at your slides that you're presenting here, and I'm having a hard time following what the packet that we were given. I don't know if I'm the Lone Ranger here, but we seem to be blowing over an awful lot of pretty important information, Don. So where are we in the discussion? Are we going to go through the proposed cottage cluster code that you gave us in our packet, or are we just going to do this high-level thing and be expected to intend to improve it?
It's really both, and it's at the discretion of the Planning Commission. We figured that it would be good just to go over the highlights, Commissioner Ewert, and then go into the substantive, and we can go through the code changes line by line as needed.
Okay, so I guess it's a little difficult to know how to approach this then. If we're going to adopt cottage clusters into our code, I think that we need to cover it. I don't know how the rest of the commissioners feel. Maybe I'm the Lone Ranger here, but I think that I've got a fair number of questions, beginning with the purpose on page 17 on through.
I'd like to go through it in more detail as well. I have some questions about the details.
So would you like to do that now, or do you want us to go through the rest of this? What would you all like us to do?
I thought the mission here was to go through these and then go right into the details,
Yeah.
like what Dan's suggesting. So kind of do the initial presentation of slides, and then let's dive into the nitty-gritty.
Okay.
We're almost done. We can pause after cottage clusters and go into the line by line. I think that's a great recommendation. So this, I believe, is the last cottage slide, but don't quote me. There might be one more.
And those drawings are referenced on page 22 of 31 and page 23 of 31. I was with Dan there. I was trying to figure out where we were at.
Sorry,
on
yes, the
drawings.
slides did not mirror
They
the
didn't track.
packet.
Yeah, it's all good. Thank you.
Yeah, trying to keep it a little graphical where we can. It's not easy when it's a code update. You can end up with a lot of words. So again, kind of just closing the loop on the high level kind of summary of the design standards. One thing that I wanted to point out that was a good opportunity with this three-dimensional concept here is this is an exact replica of the prior slide where it shows that plan view. It shows the exact same cluster. But the nice thing about this perspective is you can see there's a variation in one-story versus two-story cluster or cottages, and you can kind of see how they blend in to provide, I guess, a little bit of variety in what that cluster looks like, but also, again, has the opportunity to mirror traditional single-family neighborhoods where you see that combination of single-story and two-story. So providing some variety in what that product might look like to help with the aesthetics of these clusters integrating with existing neighborhoods. Again, what you can see here is that driveway off to the far right that's accessing those garages, and on the opposite side, that shared parking facility. One other thing just to mention here is that what you're seeing in these two graphics that we've shown are just an open courtyard, but we do have provisions in the code that allow for common community buildings to be built in those clusters, recognizing that we have unique weather here that creates it not so easy to be outside all year long. There's an opportunity for developers to choose to build, a covered patio, covered structure, some sort of alternate way for shared open space opportunity, but providing that weather protection as well. So there's some provisions in the code surrounding those community buildings. I think that might be the last slide for cottage. Perfect. And with that, I'll pause and we can go through the code as needed.
So at this point, Vice Chair Ewert, were you getting at starting from the first red line, or were you talking going literally from page 1 all the way through?
I'm fine with going from page 1 all the way through. On my screen here on the Zoom, I don't know if Lanny can hear me or not, but I can't see you all. All I can see is Don's screen. And I don't know if that's the way that's supposed to be, or I can't see the room.
I think it's the way it's supposed to be, just because there's a shared graphic for everybody to see.
Okay, all right.
think.
Then I'm going to, so.
I am not making faces at you right now, I promise.
Yeah, sure, Matt. You guys go ahead and I'll join in.
I'd like to make a proposal. Since we just talked about the cottage cluster specifically, how do you guys feel about looking at the cottage the cottage cluster language starting on page 17 of 31 and just kind of suss that out, and then how it relates to the R1 and 1.5 that were in the earlier pages? What do you think of that, Dan?
I'm good with that. Very good.
Okay.
All right. Got it. Do you want to take us through it?
Sure, I'm happy to walk through it. I think they're probably trying to put it up on screen here, but we'll get started. So just as a quick reminder, this is all new code section, so there's really no red lines. Everything is new code. So I guess I'm happy to read the purpose statement, or maybe we just open it up for questions or comments about the purpose statement. What's the commission's
Does
pleasure?
anybody have any questions or concerns of sections A through D? Because mine start in section E.
No, I don't.
Mine goes right through, A through, it falls alphabetically all the way through.
Yeah, but A, B, C, and D, I personally can say I don't have questions on at this point in
Yeah.
time.
I don't have any questions.
Dan, do you have any questions on sections A, B, C, or D of 16.21.080?
Where we go into purpose, it says the purpose of these standards are to promote more affordable fee-in, common, or fee-in ownership housing options within Canby. Can you explain the fee, affordable fee and fee or fee-in ownership, that whole fee thing? Can you explain that to me, please?
Yes, so the intention there is to basically generalize that they could either be rental or for sale product in these cottage clusters. And it's a little bit of real estate jargon. Admittedly, code sometimes can be a little dry that way.
Okay, my next one is in the next line. It says additionally, they promote quality development, a sense of openness, and community, enhanced livability, walkability, safety of the community. I really don't think that any of that stuff should be in there. It doesn't, that whole sentence is is marketing statements, and I don't think that it really has a place in our standard. It's making a statement that may or may not be true. So I don't necessarily, I would strike that entire sentence.
I'll second that recommendation.
And that's all I have on A. I don't have anything else until D.
Did anyone else have any follow-up response? I saw Commissioner Driscoll. Anybody else? Okay. So it sounds like we're moving to, oh, go ahead.
Do we make statements like this in other places in the code? Talking about the positive aspects of this or that kind of development?
Purpose statements often do. I could double check how it looks in the R1 and R15 district to see, but it isn't uncommon.
Okay.
Well, and just maybe a point of reference, that's one thing amongst many things that are missing in our current code is we really don't have purpose statements for our zones. But we do, just to, maybe as a point of reference for plan unit developments, which we're going to talk about tonight as well, there are some aspirational elements that are probably more discretionary from the Planning Commission's perspective and are intentionally more discretionary than, to Commissioner Ewert's point, versus clear and objective. So I would agree with that.
I'm just concerned whether this is a stylistic departure or something more in keeping with the rest of the code. And if it's in keeping with the rest of the code, then I don't see a problem with it. But if it's something that's kind of uneven throughout, maybe it's something we should leave for the code review coming up in 25.
I concur with that as well. Maybe at some point when we do the 25 review, if we don't have it consistently now, then we say, what are our purpose statements for each of the sections when we revise it?
And one thing that Ryan and I were talking about is, some of this very well could end up getting revisited as well as part of that code update. I'm not saying that we still need to do this tonight. We absolutely, because I want all the comments tonight, but we have to have some documentation going through with the decision makers part of this, or it stops the entire process. And so whatever the commentary are and whatever the feedback we provide back to DLCD, if that is part of this discussion, I'm glad to do that. I don't know where the limits of this are. This model code was intended to be one that provided more affordability, and I don't know where that bright line is where suddenly it's like, you might as well not do this. But I'm just, again, trying to point out what we're trying to achieve here tonight.
So the letter that we have from the DLCD is specific to this text.
It is, and to some extent, it kind of bled over a little bit to housing production strategies, although I asked them, I said, are you going to give us a housing production strategy letter as well? And they said, yes, that was this morning, because I got that letter on Friday, and because I thought that was both, but it really is, they're still going to give us another letter on housing production. But on housing efficiency measures, they're saying, yes, you've hit the mark, and that's with what we have now.
And so just for clarity's sake, you're not looking necessarily for a commission-wide consensus on any one particular item or another. You're just looking for any and all feedback from all commissioners about what we're looking at. Is that correct?
I would like to get to the core of are there concerns with this, and some of this is very dimensional standard and it's performance-based code. It's intended to be that way. And if there are concerns with that, what are those? There will obviously be other inputs besides the code here. There's, building code requirements, et cetera, that have to be met, which we're obviously not addressing here because this is a land use part of this. But if there are major items, we would like to focus on those. Yeah. Ryan, please. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to try not to chime in, but for the purpose statements, I would argue that because the Planning Commission has made the choice that they want these as a type 3 level of review, that the purpose statement gives you guys the lens to which you review those through. And so if you think about it, 7 or 8 years from now, this dais might have different people on it, and if a project is coming to them and all they have is the specific standards, but they don't have the vision for what that tool is for. That's sort of what a purpose statement in a zoning code is for, is sure, you have the side yard has to be X feet and the backyard has to be X feet, but the purpose statement is telling the reader, whether it's staff or someone who's receiving, like you guys, a type 3 project, that's what you're kind of comparing that project against, is the purpose.
But if we get a project and it meets all of the requirements that are outlined outside of the purpose statement, but it isn't in alignment with the purpose statement, would that be grounds for us to be able to reject a project and not be told that the land use board was going to reject that and come after us? Because I feel like the constructs that we have about having to make decisions wouldn't change because of the purpose statement.
I think generally you are correct. It's usually the more specific standards, and Dawn and Jessica can correct me if I'm not correct. So yeah, you're right. It is a more fuzzier thing. I think it's just, if years from now there is something in the code that someone may perceive as ambiguous, then they can look back at the purpose statement and use that to interpret the development standard that seems vague, if that makes sense. It's supposed to serve like a framework. I don't have a strong opinion either way about the purpose statement, so I'm just making the argument that's why you might want to have one.
It's a good point. I think the one thing I would add to that too is by establishing it, and maybe in this instance the language is not agreed upon, and that's an important thing to talk about here, but it does become a tool by which you look at and let the code evolve over time as well, right? We've gone through this exercise. It's been an extensive exercise to talk about what we're trying to accomplish here in Canby, and setting that vision might help future you or future planning commissioners that are in your stead and years in the future say, you know what, section 1621-0804-4B is just not hitting the mark, and we know based on this purpose statement that this was the intent, and now we need to correct for that. So it does create that that vision.
And I'm a little bit on the fence on this, but I agree with Jessica and Ryan. I think what this would force perhaps, and to your point, Commissioner Driscoll, yes, there are clear and objective standards, but I think what the middle point might be is it would force the applicant to do an exercise to identify in their findings why that is so, which would possibly influence their design. So it would at least force applicants to address those items. I think that'd be part of what Ryan is getting and Jessica's getting to, is that would this is not enough to really deny the project, but we would be asking them, if they didn't provide findings, to say, this is why this meets all the standards, that would be another basis for planning commission review.
Through that lens, then, the only part of the statement that I would question is the safety of the community. I mean, what part of this is helping with safety? I honestly couldn't give you a spitball on that, so. I mean, we want safety in the community of anything that's being.
It's a very good point. I think the one thing, the one characteristic I think that probably speaks to that is just the pedestrian connectivity. It's tying it to the parking lot. There's clear identified pathways to get to the public street, that sort of thing. But it's a bit ambiguous. I give you that.
I'll bite on that. No, that works for me. It's fair enough. Cool. Thank you.
Okay, and I think Vice Chair Ewert said he was good up until we got to section D. Dan, did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse on this whole thing. I just I agree with Ryan. I agree with what Ryan is saying. I agree with what Dawn is saying. I just think what I'm saying is we either would need to strike that, we're not in the marketing business, or just rephrase it so that it is something that future commissioners can use as a, as a stepping off point. I would just rephrase it. I don't like the way it's phrased. I guess maybe that's a better way of saying what I was trying to say. So there. So we get down to D. I just want to go over what Matt talked about earlier, and that this will be a type 3. So I guess my question is that in being the type 3, these type of developments are going to be coming before the planning commission rather than a staff level sign off. Is that correct?
That is correct. Unless you, as the commission, want that to not be the case, it will be coming forth before you all.
Absolutely not. That's what I would like to see. And then going down in D, it says number 1 in D, it says cottage cluster developments are exempt from the following sections, site design review. So it says that it's exempt from 1649-40B5, 1649-80C, and 1649-120. So we're not going to have a basis for review of these cottage clusters are going to be exempt from those 3 things. Is that what I'm reading?
Yes.
And if that is the case, why would they be that way?
Yes, so the intention is for them to be exempt mainly because we have specific standards within this section that supersede those. And so wanting from a clarity perspective to make it very, very clear and draw a bright line that those standards do not get applied to cottage clusters in addition to those actual design standards that are in this code section. So we have specific parking lot landscape standards. We have specific design standards related to setbacks and building heights and all these things within this code section, and did not want to confuse it by, not addressing other sections of the code. So we're excluding them there.
Commissioner Hayward, it's intended to really be a standalone form-based design, and I know that's maybe that's a term of art, but form-based meaning that the code essentially that we have for cottage clusters, the standards, like Jessica said, that are in there are actually the drivers for that. Instead of like looking at the other sections, we're basing this largely off of the state model code, although we made some adjustments to it, but it's largely based on the state model code.
Yeah, I got that. I read a bunch of codes that other municipalities have, and it's fairly cookie cutter, also along with what the state has. So I'm good with D. Anybody else want to talk about D? I can move on.
Nobody has any other comments on D, so we can move on through the rest.
All right, so moving on to E, development standards, I'll guess open it up for any questions on density. So this is, again, intended to provide specific development standards related to kind of spatial layout and how many units you have and setbacks. So starting with density.
I've got one for number 4, if nobody has a 1, 2, or 3.
I've got one on one, Jenny, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
And when it talks about density, it says the minimum density of any cottage cluster development is 6 units. So the minimum that we're going to have is 6. Is that correct?
Correct.
Dawn? Okay. And, but then the maximum standard, there's no number on that. So, I mean, if somebody wanted to come in and build 100, could they build 100 or 20, or how big do these things get?
So for clarity, I guess I'll just first point out by saying this is density per acre. So we're not establishing max number of cottages per a cluster, but the code is indicating that you need 6 units per acre, assuming you have an acre to develop, and then you run that math. But there is no maximum density, and the idea behind that is really not to preclude someone from being able to build it, but you have to meet everything else. You have to provide parking on site. You have to provide that courtyard, which has a direct relationship with the number of cottages you have on site. So it might sound scary, but it's that form-based code coming up again where you have to have all of these features on site to support the cottage development. And so you definitely won't see 100 cottages on an acre for sure.
Okay. All right. I just, just as a suggestion, I might throw in there per acre somewhere in that verbiage. Just just because?
It's in there.
It's actually on the second line, or very end of the first sentence on density.
Per acre, 6 units per acre. Okay, got it. Go ahead, move on. I'm going with that one.
All
Does
right,
anybody have lot area that they need to talk about? Minimum perimeter yard setback. I think we covered that already. All right. Commissioner Driscoll, you wanted to talk about number 4, go ahead.
yes, please. Thank you. All right, so number 4, the number of cottages. It says that the units have to be developed in clusters of the minimum of 4, and there's no maximum, provided that there's one common courtyard provided for every 12 cottages. So the way I read that is if somebody is developing 20 cottages, that is under the 24 threshold, that would make 2 courtyards necessary. We are still requiring the 150 feet per unit at any number, correct?
Correct, yeah, so it's a great distinction. This is just talking about the number of cottages, but as you go down later on into the courtyard
Yeah.
standards, it assigns a square footage based on the total number of cottages.
Would it be unreasonable to, in number 4, reference 3D that specifically calls out 150 square feet for each unit?
I think that makes sense, yeah.
Okay, that way nobody can say they didn't know from the
Yeah,
beginning.
absolutely.
Can I ask a question here also?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Thank you, Matt. And this is a lot of material to read, Dawn, so I'm just saying, some of it seems a little bit confusing. A lot of it does. Anyway, on number 4, it says that there's 4 units, a minimum of 4 units. But then when we just talk in density, it talks about
The 6 per
a
acre?
minimum of 6 units per acre.
So it doesn't count as a cottage unless there's at least 4, but then it also has to have at least 6 per acre. So if there's a half an acre, they couldn't build 3 cottages, they'd have to put 4.
Yeah, I think the distinction here is more about trying to establish kind of the minimum need, the minimum scale to create a cluster. And so 4 is that number, but we don't without that density number, we're not establishing how that looks across an acre. So they're measuring 2 different components of or 2 different characteristics of the development type.
Okay, well, when I read through that, one says 6, one says 4, that seems a little confusing to me. But
Okay.
I guess you guys are the ones that are gonna have to work with this, so.
Would it be a little clearer if after that first sentence we add per cluster, a minimum 4 units per cluster,
It
something?
would be clearer to me.
Okay,
Yeah, we can add that.
absolutely. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay.
Yep.
Yes.
And then the next question I had was on 5, about the building separation. The building shall be separated by a minimum distance of 6 feet. The minimum distance between all the other structures, including accessory structures, will be 3 feet. And there was another part in here, and I didn't make note of it, but it said that the minimum was 10 feet.
So the distinction here is between setbacks relative to the property line and setbacks or separation between structures. Building separation really comes into play when you're dealing with units on a common lot rather than on individual lots of record through a subdivision. So setbacks, if you're looking at a site where all the cottages are on one lot, you're looking at setbacks around the perimeter of the site. And so this building separation comes into play to create that space between units within that common cottage cluster.
Okay. So then this bounces back to the rental piece, the rental ownership, the what did you call it? The fee in common and the fee in ownership. So you're going to have 4 of these units, and they're going to be, if they're, can we have a combination of owned and rented, or are they all rented or all owned? Or do we make that distinction?
Is that HOA based?
I mean, yeah, I think
CCRs?
it's really something that could happen outside of a land use decision, because you could also create a condo development where the land is still commonly owned, but the structures themselves become saleable. So there are different ways in which this could occur, and I don't know that our code is trying to force one way or the other. We're trying to be ambiguous to provide flexibility to that ownership or rental model.
Okay, all right. Okay, so then, so these things can be then as close as 6 feet apart. Is that what I heard you say?
Correct. That's what the code is proposing at this time.
And the fire department is okay with that?
We've received some comments from Canby Fire. They haven't poured through this code. Obviously, they have discretion on each project, but essentially, there's a number of elements they're going to have to look at, and some of those will relate to things like, well, buildings need to be sprinkled. And this code for a cottage cluster, obviously is not a building code. So that's their discretion. And so really this comes down to an applicant having to meet fire code later in the process. And that would be one of those elements that we received comments today from Canby Fire, and they were asking questions around that. And they didn't say where the threshold was, but that is obviously something on their mind. And so they would have to articulate when, under what circumstances is that required? Is that related to thickness of firewalls within the building, within the homes? And there's a number of variables that the fire code allows them to do, but there did not appear to be any non-starters. But this may end up requiring sprinkling and some configurations. Just as a reference, though, there are at Redwood Landing, there are 5-foot separations for houses. So just as a reference.
Okay, all right. So the only other thing that I've got on this particular section is I found the whole off-street parking thing, the whole parking on-street, off-street, whatever, somewhat confusing. I don't know if anybody else saw that, but it seemed confusing to me.
That one's on my list too, less because it's confusing and more because I think it's unreasonable. We're talking about trying to make housing affordable for people who are struggling to be able to buy a home. And even at a 600 square foot, one of these cottages would easily cost $350. We do not live in a community that has public transit readily available. We, for all intents and purposes, are still pretty rural, and you're going to need 2 people working to afford even the smallest cluster. And I think we're doing a huge disservice both to the people who might be future owners or tenants, and also to the city as a whole if we don't require at least 2 parking spaces for each unit. Because when you deflect to extra parking on the streets, some of the streets are already fairly full and can't handle it, and it also makes it so that you're basically playing Frogger, getting across and through our neighborhood streets. And I think that that has a really negative impact on the quality of life for the community as a whole.
There is, all good points. There is no maximum parking. And just as a discussion point, we can go back to DLCD and say, we're putting 2 in. What does that mean? Do we consequentially, are we going to have to do more housing, efficiency measures or not? That's the trade-off here. I think there is this belief and that additional parking area is going to be an expense.
Yep.
That is the underlying premise here. The folks that have talked about developing cottage clusters have said, we would obviously put 2 parking spaces in. So that would, but that would be their discretion, again, on the maximum piece. But again, I don't know where that bright line is with DLCD, and hopefully this is not, straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. But that, if there's strong consensus around that need, we can put that in there. I don't know what the consequential issues are going to be around that. And so this is, again, the model code. One thing, maybe just as consideration, I'd like your consideration of this. Again, what Jessica said at the beginning, strong point here, we're not advocating for skinny streets ever. This is like full streets with, and I know there's a lot of examples of streets that are not full streets, but like we're talking, I believe this application is going to be in newer areas that are not developed now, not necessarily as much infill, but in larger chunks of area, special area J out to the north. It'll be on larger parcels of property. There may be some infill, but I think it'll be largely where you have a brand new street and those streets will meet city standards.
I am reticent to leave it up to the developers to decide what they're going to ultimately offer, because when there's a financial incentive to only put one in and nobody's going to contest that, then people who are struggling to find a place to live are left with what's available. And when you have to choose from a bunch of lousy options, you pick the option that's least lousy and that you can make work. But when making it work might be parking a couple streets away because there isn't actually parking on site. And then again, we have city streets, even newer streets, when you've got cars lining on both sides, it gets to, affect quality of life and visibility for cars, for pedestrians, for everything else. So personally, I feel really strongly about requiring two, even if that might ultimately mean having conversations about does that affect other requirements? Because to me, having lived in much more dense places, the worst thing there is not having a place to park your car.
I'd like to hear Dave's comment, or David's comment on what we're asking.
Could we,
Oh,
but before we go there, could we go to Commissioner Hutchinson?
Sorry, Mike.
Go to David.
I'm living in an R1 house right now, struggling to get it painted. My wife passed away last year. My daughter is going to college right now, and she's going to be moving out, I'm sure, within the next couple of years. I am sick of taking care of this gigantic property and this gigantic house, and there's just me. I'd love to have a little 1,000-square-foot place with one parking spot for my truck, and that's all I need, really. And there is a major shortage of places for people to retire to when they're getting sick of pushing around the mower. And so I encourage you to think about needs for housing coming from other vectors. I'm not upsizing. I'm not looking for a larger house. I'm looking for something in the other direction. And this kind of thing would actually suit me. I mean, I don't have a boat, I don't have an RV. I'm pretty sure I could find a place to put my motorcycle if I needed to. Either way, I think that I don't think that a 2 parking spot minimum is necessary. I think the people that want to sell them will have them, and I think that the people that want that unit will take it. And if they've got 2 boats and an RV and 3 rigs and everyone to drive them, then that's not what they'll be shopping for. That's just my opinion.
I guess my only concern is, we see this around town now, and we have all the street parking that's a nightmare. Trying to get out on some of these streets is crazy. I guess that's what I would worry about. But I understand what you're saying totally. But I am concerned. It seems to be a bigger and bigger problem.
And yeah, I would never seek to be saying there aren't people who are just individuals who want a place to live, a smaller place to downsize into. But there are so many other people who have life circumstances that are very different, where they don't have anywhere, they have multiple cars. The amount of people who get piled into apartments sometimes is nuts. We've got some townhomes on our street. One of them, they've got 6 cars because they've got like 8 people crammed in there. People have a lot of different circumstances. And if we're looking at trying to reach the affordability level of people who are struggling to have affordable stuff, those are the people who are going to only be able to barely squeak into something small that for you is a downsize, but for them is the only size.
I think Dawn said it best. I think, we can't solve all the ills of the economy, but we're making the attempt, right? So at this point, I think we're considering a product that, does the best we can do within our purview to accomplish the goal or the edict from the state on high to provide a different option for people.
Yeah, the
But-
state's trying to keep the footprints of the entire plot small.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you talk about a parking spot, that's a couple hundred feet.
Yeah.
So, you know, increasing the number of square feet as a minimum on a unit, I don't think is going to cut the price at all, functionally.
David, was there any legal thing about us mandating one way or the other, or recommending, I should say, a council obviously has to decide what they want to do with it, but can they do that? Can they say you will do 2 parking spots on each one of these if we recommend it?
Yeah, I think it's within their discretion to have a parking minimum that would be higher than 1. It's gonna, I think as Don alluded to, there's then gonna be some tension with how, whether it's the state or somebody else is looking at, if you do that, it's gonna chew up property that would otherwise maybe be available for more housing. So, you know, it's not to say that you can't, it's more of a question of if you do, what effect is that going to have on some of the other efficiency measures? And that's something that we can have a discussion, you know, at least with the LCD and get a sense about that. Really, the way that parking works now, I think you may all know this, is that, you know, the other way is really what the state wants to encourage, right? Like no minimums, basically. I'm not suggesting that that's something that works in most communities, so I certainly understand why you'd want to have something. But I think that the city could do that. It's just going to be a question of how does that affect, you know, the other strategies that you have to try to increase efficiency within the UGB.
And another question, just because of the style of this product, and I'm not familiar with ADA requirements, how does ADA requirements fit into a product like that? If I'm out of my lane, let me know. But I'm just curious, when we're talking about parking and you're dealing with the example that you showed, which would probably be like the minimum example, I don't see where or how that factors in. Do you happen to know how that factors in, or is that a discussion for another day?
And just observationally, I don't think that single-family products are really regulated based on ADA, period. I mean, like, that becomes a consumer issue. I mean, obviously getting through the threshold, et cetera, but I don't think yet every home is built to ADA standard. I think some of them have stairs. Some of them do have ramps. I think the modern, more product types are going to start to be more sensitive to that and try to be at grade. Commissioner Hutchinson, raised some good points about, there's a lot of folks that have a variety of needs, and I think that's important to factor in here as well as that. And that, because these could be single story, they may not be 2-story. I mean, what the product types, they're varied, but I mean, so.
It's hard not to view these almost like you would like an apartment community.
Yeah,
you know what I mean, with the
they're
shared
not-
lot and all that.
They're really not. I mean, these are really small houses on small
Right.
lots, but it's a bit of a village, to be honest with you. I mean, that's kind of what the concept here is.
Right.
And I mean, it's taking off in all parts of the metro area. I think ours is more on the suburban side. I mean, it just is. I mean, we're not Milwaukee or Portland. We're not doing that kind of density. And so it is a bit of a blend here, but I think that is starting to take off as a product type, and it's appealing when there's this courtyard and people want that lifestyle, and it's their price point can fit that price point as well.
So would it be fair at this point then to say it would just be a consideration for council to
Yeah, I would
decide?
say that would be one of those items to highlight, and we'd be fine doing that.
Yeah. Not on the ADA, I meant just the parking minimum.
Yeah.
So duly noted, Commissioner Driscoll, duly noted, Commissioner Hutchinson, send it to the
I
commission.
think, Commissioner Ewert, you may have had a question about the language being a bit confusing. I know we got focused on the number, but was there something that you wanted to see different there for better clarity?
Well, as far as the parking goes, I get what Michael's saying. we're trying to, it's really, really difficult because we've got a huge mix here in our town of people that live here. And the problem, and I get it, that, you know, there's gonna be some people out there that just need one parking spot and they're good with that, and that's all good. The problem is, though, is just like what Jenny was saying, is that we've got those situations around town where people are renting out their garages and they're renting out their bedrooms, and they've got 2 cars for each room, and we've got parking lining our streets. And so that becomes a problem. And in this dense of a situation, that's going to be a problem. That could be very much a problem. If you have one of these units that has 3 or 4 adults living in one unit, and you've got 3 or 4 cars, we got a problem. Now, whether we combine that parking into community parking or overflow parking or whatever somehow, but I think that we would be remiss if we go anything less than 2 parking spots with these places. So that's my feeling on that. I hear all the sides of the story, and you know, I agree. I can agree with all sides of the story, but I would be remiss, and I don't want to. I get almost a little bit tiresome of running in fear of the state of Oregon. You know, I could use a lot of strong words here, but I'm not. This is our town. It's not, our town does not belong to the state of Oregon. And I believe we're in the state of Oregon. I get it. But we just got to be really, really careful of a dictatorial type of a thing where all of our decisions and even our zoning codes are based on fear of what the state of Oregon is going to do to us. And so I just, that thinking really, really bothers me. So I come down on 2 parking spots, and I'd like to make that a clarification. And I also, the on-street versus the on-site versus, I think that the verbiage of that, and especially in number 9, could be cleaned up. I don't know how else to quite say that. I wish I could offer, I hate to offer an objection and not have a clarification, but in this particular case, I just think that this could be cleared up a little bit.
So noted, thank you.
I'm a little bit concerned about making the designation of what's going to be allowed on a street that does allow on-street parking at the time that this is being reviewed and approved, specific to existing streets and development in an area that's already been built up. Because we do in some instances have streets that would be different than if they were being built today. And where we do have those narrower streets, you might technically be allowed to park on them today. At some point, it might need to be revisited because with cars lining both sides, it's not.
The only thing I would say to that is when we did our inventory and we looked at some of the infill opportunities, I mean, there's not a lot of infill opportunities that would put like a couple of dozen, or, you know, a couple of groupings or whatever we're calling them, a couple of clusters. I think we're talking 4.
4 or 6, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like most of the ones we saw in that inventory, Don, correct me if I'm wrong, or Ryan, most of the ones we saw were like 0.4 acre, maybe 0.5 or just barely over half acre within the infill area. I feel like what we're addressing is probably more like what you had said earlier, which is that the area we're going to potentially expand into, where you're going to have all new development and potentially part of a PUD in a new area altogether. I just don't think they have the room to have the impact just by virtue of what's available in the inventory now. Could be wrong, but it seemed like it was going to be
And
minimal.
I think you're correct. I think it's more on the periphery and the expansion area, but our buildable lands inventory piece, there really aren't a lot of pieces that are tiny that are left and remaining. They're kind of on the outskirts. They're in the northwest quadrant of the city. They're in the northeast quadrant, and they're in the south of the city. And,
Right.
And those, I mean, some of them will convert over 20 years. Some of them that are in farming may not convert for 20 years. I mean, some of those are being used as agriculture, and that's another kind of rub on the whole buildable lands thing. But because that may not convert, but that's another discussion. But I think we're not talking necessarily about infill, and this is also R1 and R15, not R2. And so if somebody's got R2, they're in a totally different category. They have to build 14 units an acre, and that's mandatory. So this is a range here of, of units. And so I think this is really like new development versus could you do redevelopment? Yes, but is it really going to really in practicality be that way? It's really going to be new development with new roads. But Commissioner Driscoll, to your point, also Canby Fire is starting to take a more thorough stance on, you can park on this side of the street, but you can't park on this side of the street. So I think we're going to know. I mean, I think those are the things that we're seeing in their comments.
Okay, thanks.
So moving on to, unless anybody else got anything else on that one.
I had on 8, the one before it, the maximum impervious surface. So it says that it's going to be standard of the underlying zones. And then when we're looking at the common courtyard, it says that in number 3E, that it has to be developed with a mix of landscaping and lawn, recreational amenities, hard surface paths, and it's not to exceed 75% of the total common courtyard, which is a very high level of impervious surface becoming impervious. So how does that tie into the overall land use and the underlying?
So I'm going to attempt a math problem on the fly, which is not going to go very well for me because I'm a
Stick with
planner,
the
not an
tens.
engineer, but we're going to try here.
Okay.
So I think the thing to consider is we're talking specifically about the the courtyard. So let's say it's a 4-unit, 4 cottage development. So we're talking 600 square feet of a courtyard, right? 150 per unit. The standard is saying a max of 75% can be impervious. So we're talking,
450.
yeah, thank you. So that's 450 square feet across the whole site. I think the code allows up to 70% of these sites in R15 to be impervious. So I don't think it's prohibitive there because we're talking about such a small area for the courtyard. Does that answer your question?
So it sounds like more or less, we're looking at the land that the buildings are being built on with the underlying code, and then the courtyard area has its own.
Well, no, they're not separate. I think
They
what
are
it's
still-
trying to do is dictate that there's some landscaping in that courtyard. We don't want it all to be like hardscape. You want something soft there. So it's trying to just create that blend for the courtyard, but they're not mutually exclusive. They're not meant to be prohibitive. And so that 450 square feet, and I thank you for having that ready for me, would count in the total amount of the site. So it would be added along with any pedestrian connections that aren't inside that courtyard area, right? Because if you think back to that example, there's a connection out to the parking lot, for example, or up to the street. Those might be technically outside of the cluster if you're drawing a line. So we'd be adding that along with your parking facility, and that together would be, along with your building, your roofs would be your total impervious for the site. But it would be a consolidated total number.
So the pedestrian paths on the next one, 3F, so pedestrian paths qualifying as part of the common courtyard. It's parking areas, setbacks, and driveways don't qualify as part of the common courtyard, but the pedestrian paths do and would be included in the 75% ratio of the common predominantly shared courtyard area.
So maybe let me ask a question. Is the concern that we're going to exceed or somehow count it separately, or are you just trying to understand how we calculate it?
A little bit of both. The
Okay.
reason that I'm asking is because if we're talking about having open space and then you can pave 75% of it and then the pedestrian paths around it are included in that, then have we left anything unpaved for a common space?
25% is the minimum requirement. That's how I would read and interpret it. We would draw a line on your site plan. Here's your cottage courtyard. Here's the square footage we need, or here's what we're proposing. And you draw a line around that, and then you calculate impervious surfaces compared with non-impervious surfaces and verify that it's not exceeding that 75-25 requirement. But then there's also an overall site impervious maximum.
But specific to the common area and just having space available for use.
Sure.
So with our 4 cottage cluster, I want to keep saying clutter today, I'm sorry. With the 4 cottage cluster example, we've got 600 square feet that's supposed to be shared amongst everyone. But pedestrian paths reduce that space because they do not qualify, or they do qualify as part of the common courtyard. So if we have a courtyard of X amount, X is not actually 600, X is 600 minus the paths around it.
So the issue
that's
is so your thought is that ped paths don't provide any sort of value, so they shouldn't be calculated maybe? Or is that the issue?
I think that they do provide a ton of value
Okay.
in terms of accessibility, getting to your house without trudging through the mud, to the sidewalk, to the street, to your car, et cetera. But I don't really love that they're considered part of the common courtyard calculation, because you might have you're going to have a 5-foot wide path around in more or less a circle of whatever that common courtyard area is. And so reducing the amount of open space by the amount of any path that's circling it really cuts into open space, of which 75% of it can be paved. Does that make sense?
No. I'll be honest, it doesn't, because you have the pavement and then you have concrete pathways that lead to everybody. They're all common, right?
Yes.
And they're all bordering the common area.
Yes.
So how is that not all common area?
No,
That's what I'm not getting.
A lot of the intention of having common space was, these are people who don't have yards. They might not have access to their own green space. So we wanted to bake in something for people who are living more densely with one another, to have an open space that is not just paved area, right? It is a common space that can be used. And in my interpretation, that also includes some degree of green space. So if we are requiring a relatively small area to be designated as open shared space, perhaps some of it green, we've got 600 square feet that's required for the 4 cottage cluster. But then all of these paths have to be a minimum of 5 foot wide, and whatever distance they go around an open area. So you could easily eat up at least a third of the space that would elsewise be open area, because it's a pathway, it's a walkway. The walkway is commonly used by everybody, but is it giving you any recreational area? Is it giving you any relaxation area? Is it giving you a place to meet with your neighbors and commune? No, it's a pathway. So I'm disinclined to include a walkway, which is a safety feature, as open usable recreational space. And right now, we are including it in open available recreation space.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Of course.
I understand.
If somebody's moving, no one gets to use the sidewalk for recreation. That's just how it works out. Because it's like, if you need the sidewalk to move your couch down, you're not going to let somebody put out their lawn chair there.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense.
That it's not recreational space.
Yeah. So I think a couple opportunities maybe to address that concern would be perhaps excluding pedestrian pathways from the total, or perhaps proposing an increase in the total square footage that is allowed, but allow them to be included in the courtyard. I think the other question that, and you might have answered it, but is there also a desire for there to be a larger percentage of landscaping in that courtyard, or are you okay with up to 75%? And I will say, to preface that, the idea is meant to, landscaping is very important and it should be there, but there's also other things you can do that are impervious improvements that aren't specifically sidewalks. It could be a play structure. It could be a covered outdoor patio barbecue area, right? And so I think that was trying to provide that flexibility that there might be other true open space amenities that people will benefit from that aren't just sidewalks. So that was the kind of idea behind that.
And I would just echo that. I'm visualizing, I know, just bear with me for a minute, but like, think of Disney World or Disneyland. Those paths, I know they're large, but that is part of your experience. I mean, they're landscape, they create themes around them. So I think it's about what is around the pathway, in my view, as well as to whether or not that should be counted, to Jessica's point. I mean, I think that's part of it. If it's highly articulated and landscaped with an adjacent path versus just a path, I mean, if it was an integrated master plan, and a lot of these will be master planned, I mean, they're not going to, they're building communities and thinking of less of this as something, I think this is a unique builder situation here. I don't think that somebody's necessarily going to go in and cut their teeth on this. They've done this before if they're going to do this. And I think a lot of the products that we've shown kind of show that integrated master plan and thematic elements where you're walking through, and it is nicely landscaped along the entire corridor, and it does create this kind of thematic village piece to it.
I have a question.
Please.
Go ahead, Dan.
Dawn, in this, I agree with what Jenny is saying. I believe that, we just had this discussion in one of the things that we heard a few months back, where they were building some townhouses, and the question came up, where are the kids going to play? And so in this scenario, that we're looking here with these cottage clusters, it seems to me that we're really encouraging this not to be something for families, because there's going to be no place for the kids to play. There's not going to be any place to store their bikes. So it is. I would say that we're kind of gearing. We're doing a thing here that is. It's really not a family thing. It's a young adult, retired person type of a thing. So I think that anything we're doing that's going to, if we want to have families here, then we need to look at that community space as more of a space, because these units don't have any yards, and so there's not going to be any place for the kids to hang out and play other than in the streets, and so. We had the discussion and we didn't really like that. The other thing that I had a question is that following along with what Commissioner Driscoll was saying, we have that courtyard area, and then we've got this, but we're using it up with sidewalks and so on and so forth. But if you'll scroll down just a little bit in number 4, where it talks about community, there you go, where it talks about community buildings, it says here that each cottage cluster is permitted one community building. And then it says a community building shall not exceed 1,400 square feet of total. Then it goes down and says here that the community buildings may not count towards a cottage cluster's common courtyard requirement. So in my mind, is that saying that if they have a community building, that they don't have to have additional courtyard space because of the square foot of the community building, or the community building is using up a part of the courtyard space? That's confusing a little bit to me.
It reads to me that it's saying that it can be in replacement of the community space or the open space.
Or at least the
So in other words,
75%.
you have a community building, you put in a community building in this, and you can do away with the courtyard space?
I don't think that's the intent, mainly predicated on the requirement that you can't do more than 75% of that courtyard as impervious. So I would argue that there'd still be a need for 25% of pervious, which I would expect would be landscaping to some extent. There's also still a requirement that you connect the site and all of the cottages to the amenity spaces. So I don't think you could really do that and not end up with connecting pedestrian walkways through the site. But to your point, it doesn't explicitly say that, but I think it'd be very hard to set up a cluster that has that community building but has no way to get to it.
Well, there'd be a way to get to it, but there's probably going to be like roughly 2 feet of grass and bushes around a building to.
Well, and I think to the point, this is a may, not
Yeah.
a shall.
Sure.
So I think, the next question is, we're saying 1,400 square feet of a community building, that's a pretty good sized cottage cluster based on our math earlier, right?
Yep.
So we're talking more than 12 cottages at that size. So it's a much bigger site that we're dealing with too. So different things to consider as that scale goes up. And again, this is a may, not a you shall.
Okay.
Yep. For me, I would circle back and just say 3F, that the pedestrian paths qualify as part of a common courtyard. I'd ask us to revisit that and actually say that it does not count as part of the common courtyard, because it is just a basic amenity. You can't play in it.
So you're saying the language is pedestrian paths are excluded as part of the common courtyard?
That would be my request, if you are amenable.
Got it.
Because even saying
Noted.
that things can be landscaping, you can't play in landscaping. If you've got some pretty bushes, great, but nobody's actually doing anything in it. So that's just a general concern of mine, is if landscaping does not make open space,
Yep.
in my mind. It's still nice to have. I would never say don't landscape anything at
Yep.
all, but it's not open.
So, okay, so as for the rest of the commission, are we good to move on to 4?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody have anything for 4?
No.
Well, I'm still saying the same thing, Matt. So the way I read this, you could put in a community building and do away with the need for your common space.
Up to
Except-
You don't
75%.
make places a common space.
Except for the fact that you have the impervious requirement. So it kind of negates that. And the square footage of it is larger than an actual cottage unit itself. Because they call out cottage units 600 square feet to 1,200 square feet, right? So you're talking, to your point, you're talking a much bigger
Cottage development.
cottage development.
Well, the community building is up to 1,400 feet, not
Yes.
a minimum of 14.
Correct,
Right.
yeah. So
So it could be
can
any size.
It can scale. Maybe a good clarification here would be to re-reference that 25% or indicate that the community building cannot count for more than 75% of the required common courtyard area, just for clarity's sake. I think that could
Thank you.
be a
Thank you.
beneficial add. Yeah, absolutely.
So not more.
So maybe add like a 4D to that. That's just spitballing. I'll think of something there, but.
All right, I have the common space. Okay.
Because of the flow of the conversation, I skipped section 2, but may I ask that we look at section 2, letter C? It says that cottages not facing the common courtyard or street must have their main entrances facing a pedestrian path that provides a reasonably direct connection to the common courtyard. Reasonably direct seems very vague. Is there something we could add to make that a little bit more clear, that we are saying that there needs to be a connection to the courtyard?
I think that makes sense. I think the intention is that it would be along the pedestrian pathway that ties directly, and it's probably not a great example because it's small, and so on our examples, it's pretty close and reasonably direct. But would it be enough to just say that a connected pedestrian pathway or a continuous pedestrian pathway that connects to the courtyard? Because I think the challenge would be especially if you have a developer who might, by example, want to be a little more spacious, right? We're setting minimum building separations and things like that. There's nothing that says they can't spread it out a little bit. And so you could imagine the courtyard's only so large, so you're going to eventually run out of space for all the cottages to face it. So you may have a few off to the side. I think it'd be pretty challenging and a little bit arbitrary to put a dimension on it. I think it'd just be so difficult to guess. But if we make it clear that a direct pedestrian connection is that enough to address the concern? Or a continuous, I should say, rather than direct?
Well, the whole point of it, it's saying if it's not facing the courtyard or the street, then it has to have a pedestrian path that provides reasonably direct connection to the courtyard. It would just be kind of like, I don't know. I don't know if the courtyard would even be the number one priority. If your house doesn't face the street or the sidewalk, is the courtyard then important because it's a path to the parking too? I don't know. It just it's not something that I can fully visualize.
It's a bit unique, this product type too, right? I think very much we're set in set up a land use kind of program where you have frontage, right? That is a very clear and required thing. And here it becomes nebulous, especially as you get kind of back in little sections of the cluster. And so I think the intent here is to recognize that not all cottages are going to face the street or have that very direct facing that common courtyard. And so trying to make sure there's continuity and and a feeling of kind of connection with the remainder of the cluster that might have that more prominent position on those more traditional frontages. That's at least the intent, but I'm not sure how to better address it.
I think you pretty well nail it, because, they might be canted 20 degrees off from facing the daggone park, right? So are they, how much do we want to really parse and nitpick the thing? I think you said continuous and direct connection. I think that addresses pretty much any of the concern.
The first time I read it, I was reading that as you might not actually have a paved path from your home out. And ultimately that was the prevailing concern, that you're not asking people to not have a walkway. So I guess my request would be to clarify that you still are going to have a walkway from any cottage cluster building to something paved from your home to the rest of the paving, whatever it may be, if it's the the common area, or even if it's just to the main sidewalk that takes you to parking. I don't think it really matters necessarily what it connects to, as long as there is something paved connecting a front door to other paved things.
So I do think we cover that in section 5, where we talk about pedestrian access, and it requires connectivity between each cottage to the following characteristics of the development, which include the courtyard, shared parking areas, any community buildings, and abutting public sidewalks. So it gets added at a later section.
It does.
It's a good distinction, though, and I think if you guys are amenable to the continuous and reasonably direct.
I am.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, on to section 5, pedestrian access. Any comments? Did we lose Mr. Ewert? Okay, I think
He's still on.
Oh, is he? Okay. Okay, going once, going twice. How about section 6? Okay. Existing structures, section 7. Anyone?
Matt?
Yes, sir.
Section 6, I have one quick question for the folks. On screening, landscaping, fencing, or walls at least 3 foot tall shall separate clustered parking areas and parking structures from public streets and residentially zoned properties. I believe, in my opinion, that if we have someone that builds up against another R1 situation that's not in a cluster situation, that 3 foot is pretty short. I don't know if I'm the Lone Ranger on that, but a 3 foot fence or 3 foot landscaping is not a very sight obscuring situation if that's the point.
Commissioner Ewert, if we said that was on the interior of the project, would that be sufficient?
Well, the way I read this, or the way I look at this, is if somebody built one of these things, Don, what, and it was, say, up against somebody's backyard, you know, pick a subdivision, and that this would go in by, would 3 foot just seems a little short to me. I don't know.
The intention, I think, behind that shorter height, because you're right, it's not your traditional buffer you see where it's more like 6 feet at your property line. The intention here was to diffuse any headlights that might be perpendicular. If you remember back or flip to whatever page is probably the next one in your packet that shows the diagram where you've got that parking lot where vehicles will come in and they will point in the direction of the adjacent property. That hedge is intended to diffuse headlights at night rather than provide a screen for the entire development from adjacent properties. So that was the idea behind it, hence the shorter area and the smaller location along the site, just around that parking facility. But to your point, yes, it won't screen everything based on its design.
I would imagine the neighbors are probably going to put in their own 6 foot fence if it's not already one there.
And I would even be okay with stopping it at public streets, Dan, and then maybe saying that, I'm not sure what the standard should be. I totally get what you're saying. But I mean, if it's a street, it's up to them because they're not abutting another property. But I mean, I think we could put something in there. Yeah.
I feel a little more comfortable with that, Dawn.
Yeah.
To throw something else out there along with this is I'm concerned about the screening going too close to the street where it's going to impact site visibility for cars that are coming in and out, the sidewalks that are there, they're in neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. Just perhaps putting in some kind of parameters about how far away from the street or the sidewalk the screening landscaping needs to be so that it's not potentially making something more dangerous in the name of trying to make things look prettier.
And there is a visual triangle.
I remember seeing that somewhere.
It's going to be, that's in our code. That's
And that has to do with
gonna
landscaping
apply.
too?
Yeah, that would totally apply. It's not a section that's been removed. So
Okay.
to your point, like alleys, et cetera, not that I don't think we'll have alleys, but I'm visualizing an alley when you said that. Yeah.
I also think at 3 feet, that's actually usually below. It's at 42 and I think to somewhere above, because you think about where you're sitting inside of a car, there's some geometry there that starts to come into play. But that 3 foot hedge is usually below or at that kind of minimum threshold. But to Don's point, this is not meant to circumvent any other design consideration in the code that is not expressly excluded here. So site distance should 100% control.
Beautiful, thank you.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to number 7?
Yes.
Existing structures. Any comments from Mr. Ewert? Nope. Moving on.
No, wait a minute now.
God bless America. Here we go.
Fast
Move on
enough.
nice and quickly. I have a question down on.
Where's that mute button? Sorry, go ahead. I'm just kidding.
You're not getting off that lucky, okay? So existing structures, I am assuming, Dawn, that we have this little paragraph in here so that if somebody happens to have, and we have already talked about this, that there's very, very few situations where we have a half acre or more. And I'm not really sure I agree with that, but we've talked about that. But is this so that if there's a house already on there and somebody can figure out how to squeeze a cottage cluster onto a lot with an existing house on it, that they don't have to tear down the house? Is that why that paragraph is in there?
Yes, that's the situation, and those are rare, but they do come up. And what's interesting about that is there's a house move that happened, I think, which was not like a cottage cluster, but that was like a parent parcel situation. I think and then people either recast that and do some sort of other development, yes, but if somebody had a home and they wanted to integrate that in, that would be the intention.
Okay, so that was that. And then the other thing that I saw as lacking in this is that we've done this before with other developments, but I didn't see any mention, and maybe I just missed it, but I didn't see any mention of any responsibility for maintenance or HOAs or anything to kind of govern these little pieces of part rented, part owned situation that we are creating here. As where it talks about that they maybe, can't have non-running vehicles or RVs or boats or, that the trees need to be maintained and so on. I didn't see anything that is compulsory to whoever's building this, that's part of a cottage cluster. We have entire neighborhoods developments that have HOAs governing them, and they're a help to the city sometimes as long as they keep going. But I can really see it being important in these things that we have some type of governing, some way that this keeps looking nice, that it stays maintained, pride of ownership type of a thing. So I didn't see that anywhere in this document.
Yeah, you are correct. And to that point, a lot of, I know this, maybe this is a slightly different product type, but, we don't always know what's going to happen in subdivision. It's either, I know they typically have HOAs, and whether they're like, some of them are quite dense, like, Redwood Landing, but they still had HOAs. I'm not really sure. The state model doesn't really address that. I think actually most of our codes don't address that. We don't require that for any subdivisions, really. It's presumed that there's going to be an HOA, I think is generally the presumption.
I was going to say, I don't see very many situations, if anywhere, this wouldn't have an HOA. There's too much to be maintained, and there's too much community involvement to not have an HOA.
I think the
Or
common
reliance,
ownership,
rather.
the common ownership would probably force that to happen. This is where David maybe can input on this a bit, but if he has experience with that.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. I do think that given the characteristics of this type of development, it would almost be a certainty that the developer would want to have some sort of owners association for that very reason. The other thing I would say too is, and I don't know, with regard to Commissioner Irwin's, the range or how specific he's envisioning, but you should, just also kind of keep in mind that the city has nuisance codes, that apply for everything across the city. So if you were looking at it from the point of view of, junk accumulating or cars and RVs, the sort of what I'll call the eyesore, no matter where it might be, that would be something I would say that we would probably look to the city's nuisance code before we look to anything else. So there's that piece as well.
Thank you, David.
I agree with what David said. That's true. We do have that. We actually now have a code enforcement officer in our great little city. So, I'm sure she would be more than happy to take care of these things. But, you know, the whole thing with the HOA, it has to do with trees, with landscape. I mean, somehow this has to keep, we keep calling this a product. Somehow this product has got to, we got to keep putting lipstick on the thing here. And it has to be a saleable product moving forward. Once the developer sells off all of these things and he moves on to Hawaii, we live here. And so I can't, and I get it that, you know, well, you know, people are going to have pride of ownership and so on and so forth, but not necessarily. And so it gives us a little bit of, I just would like to see some mention of the developer, if he's going to do this, that he puts in place an HOA system that is accountable to the city, that people are doing what they're, what was the word that we, our intent, that our intent is upheld in this product that we have. So I just think that verbiage is lacking in this, and I would like to see something addressing that.
One comment I have to that, just from my experience, it can be really challenging, especially on smaller versions of these developments where you might be dealing with only 4 or 5 or 6 cottages, to have a true homeowners association. So I think I would recommend for the commission tonight, if we are looking at language, that it be a little bit broader in its terminology, so that perhaps a shared maintenance agreement could be in place between the common owners of the cluster, or something providing an alternate mechanism for protecting the city's interest in that way without it being a homeowners association. Be very challenging to create a president and a vice president and a treasurer when you've got four cottages in a cluster, and it's got a cost and an expense associated with it as well. So just something for consideration for you all.
Do CCNRs?
Makes it very easy to get your officers if there's only 4, so.
Also true.
President, vice president, and the treasurer, so we're good to go. No, but I just think we need to have some verbiage. We need to, you know, the whole discussion tonight is about how do we make this product work for our community? And I realize that we want to do this, and whether I agree with it or disagree with it, apparently this is the direction we're going to go. But I have to look at the other 30,000 residents that live in and around us, and you know, we're developing something here that is, if it's going to be a piece of candy, I'd like for it to be a nice tasting piece of candy to the rest of the community. And we're in place to make it that way and put in as much safeguards as we possibly can to make this thing look good. And, you know, like we talked about earlier, you know, 10, 20 years from now, I don't want to be looked upon like, you know, well, those idiots didn't do this right, and so on and so forth, and now we got to fix it and so on. If we can fix it in the onset, I'd like to see that done. And I think that we need to have some type of and it doesn't have to be an HOA, it could be something. I mean, there's got to be some outline of responsibility that can go with this type of development. I can't believe that people put it in and have nothing.
Do CCNRs exist, and can they exist and be enforceable in absentia of an actual HOA body?
I think it would depend on how they're written. I mean, I've definitely seen maintenance agreements. It's, and where I've seen it most often is when you have a private shared driveway, or a shared private street, even where there's an expectation of shared responsibility for the cost of that. maybe David has an opinion about how CCNRs might be able to be used or implemented without an HOA, but that's where I've seen it is more in a maintenance agreement.
Sure.
Where there's cost associated with that.
Would we potentially be able to call those parking areas under the enforcement of, like, the city code enforcement? So if there are inoperable trailers or RVs or abandoned vehicles or anything that's eating up their parking space, that we could somehow allow the city to ticket them and deal with it like they would if it was on the street? Because, we can't do a HOA, but maybe that would be something that would be acceptable language. And then in a worst-case scenario, things wouldn't just be left sitting there for a cluster of people who may or may not actually be intertwined in terms of responsibility financially, because maybe they own the house and who knows who owns the land and whatever else. They don't have to fend for themselves to get something towed off of what's basically their parking lot.
You could have standards that would say, only these types of, let's just pick on vehicles for a second, only these types of vehicles would be allowed, or, no boats, or, whatever that might be. And then, and again, kind of, if you don't have the HOA, the idea of an owners association is sort of the easiest, most elegant way to kind of deal with these types of, conditions, covenants, restrictions, CCNRs. The upside is that puts that obligation on the owners themselves of the property or the future owners. I'd be remiss, and I think maybe many of us know this, it would be naive to think that all of them survive and actually work. A lot of them don't. It's a bit of a hit or miss situation with owners associations. Some of them, 10 years hence, they really are basically zombies. And cities, not just Canby, everywhere kind of confront that. So having something else that would also allow what amounts to code enforcement would certainly be, something to consider. So if you had a list of things that would be allowed or maybe wouldn't be allowed in let's say a parking area, even if the HOA wasn't acting to enforce that, the city would still have, at least theoretically, the way to go about, like a code enforcement action. That would be possible.
I was going to ask if that defaults to that nuisance clause you were talking about in some instances where if there was an issue on there, you have a nuisance issue, a resident can contact the city and it can be dealt with, I'm assuming, through that channel as well.
Yeah. Normally the nuisance, ordinance or, and I have to admit, I don't know Canby's by heart, but everyone's a little bit different. But the thrust of it usually is going to be something that rises to a level that is pretty bad. Not so much that, the grass is not being mowed. It could be. Certainly like during, warm, hot, fire seasons, et cetera, that can be really, really awful. But if it's more, we're talking about aesthetics rather than, maybe risks to people's health or well-being. Nuisance code is normally not going to cover those things. And so maybe it's a matter of just being much more specific about what you're looking for. Because those things themselves could be the basis for a code enforcement action.
Yeah, I would agree with what Doug said. We need to have some basis to where if it is not, like you said, who's going to maintain the landscaping that we're talking about? We would like to see in here. One we have seen it over and over and over again. I'll never forget one of the business people that we approved a plan that he brought in, and he this was years ago, but we approved a plan that he brought in because he agreed to expand his landscaping, and so he did the landscaping, but he left all the things in the pots. And as soon as he got it done and everything was good, he got his thing, he just went and pulled them all up and I don't know where he did with them, but they were gone. And so because we didn't have a way of maintaining that. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to happen. I'm just using an example. People tend to say, yes, we're going to do this, but then they don't. And then we end up with a product that is in the middle of our R1, which we are going out of our way to make happen. And we've got an eyesore in the middle of housing development. So I'm just thinking that we probably need to add some section here that guards us just a little bit. And so anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
It's tricky, but it's an interesting point. I mean, if you've got one of these little cottage cluster homes, you're very unlikely to have a lawnmower. Even if you were inclined to use it, where would you put it?
How much of that is stuff that we put on the builder to put in place for maintenance needs?
I mean, Dan, I hear your point on, like, he had an occupancy permit in that situation, and then he just, after he got the occupancy permit, he just took the plans and left. I mean, obviously, we'll be doing the inspections. I mean, I think there's a less of a risk here because, like, I think we're talking about materials that are not going to be easily removed. I mean, first of all, we're not going to allow pots, but I mean, that wouldn't.
Never again.
So I mean,
No, that's not my point.
I know,
My
I
point
understand.
is that we're creating a product here that we're calling it affordable housing, okay? And I got to be real careful what I'm trying to say here, but we have, they're spending just enough money to get into this. And like was said, sometimes there's not even a lawnmower available. And so, and we need this to look good. If we want it to keep happening, we need it to look good. This has to be a product that we can sell, and it makes our community look good. And the only way that this is going to look good is if the striping in the parking lot stays painted and the landscaping stays up to date and the what do we call them, cottages are in good repair. This needs to be a product that we can sell to the community, because we're I mean, this is a new thing. And if we're going to sell it to the community, it has to look right, it has to be right. And so I think that there just needs to be maybe some research into somebody else's. I can't believe that everybody else just overlooks that. There's got to be somebody out there that has some kind of a structure that maintains this going into the future. So I think that that's an important piece of what we are doing here tonight.
And and we can do this offline, but I'm thinking like full circle shared maintenance agreement or HOA required prior to occupancy permits. So we have to see that. We don't normally look at HOAs. That's not something our code really addresses, but I think we could put something in there saying shared maintenance agreement or HOA is required prior to occupancy permit, which needs to address ongoing maintenance, and whatever the language needs to be, but essentially that's hopefully getting to the point.
Yeah,
So we at least know that that's the intent, that they're going to file that. I mean, so I don't know when that's done actually and like how that's recorded, et cetera, but it seems like it would need to be in place before they ended up selling the products anyway. I'm just guessing. Jessica, that's that right? Yeah.
Yes, in my experience, those things are recorded, and usually the agencies, if it is something that's in code, would require proof of that prior to final plat or occupancy permit. I think would be a good alternative in this instance where we might not have a plat.
Yeah.
I have
and the thing of it is the ones that go on an existing lot, a larger lot, I'm not too concerned about that, because if the people keep their house on that and they do a 4 cluster thing on their large lot, they're probably gonna be making sure that stays nice. But that needs, if they sell their main house and they move on, that little cluster that they've created there needs to stay looking good. And along with all of them, I just think we need to have something, Don, and the verbiage that you just said is a good start. I don't know how much the other commissioners feel like we need to drill down into this, but I would like to see some kind of verbiage in this new code that makes this a good thing moving into the future.
In a lot of ways, it's not that different than some of the larger developments. I mean, they have common areas, they have agreements that take care of the common areas. The common areas in this instance are the parking lot and the impervious that we're talking about, and maybe a structure. So it feels like it's the same as the larger developments, just fund size, you know? It's like.
Yeah, and I think maintenance is the key issue, of all that. I mean, part of this is, I think that would cover the intent in them. If they're going to theoretically, if they're going to maintain their properties, they probably aren't going to have problems with derelict vehicles and boats and all kinds of storage issues.
Right.
I'm just guessing that if you have good landscaping thematically, you're probably not going to have the other issues.
And like other HOAs that have been defunct, you may have an uprising in the neighborhood and they fire their HOA and, and the common areas go to hell in a handbasket anyway. I've seen both in a large development, small development. I don't know where a cottage cluster really is any that different in that regard, other than home and lot size and the specifics of the common area. But the intent is exactly the same.
I agree with what Matt's saying, and I also think that if somebody, we got the, what did you call it, Dawn, the community building, whose responsibility is the community building moving forward?
Right.
Yeah, and that would be included, I'm sure, in the maintenance agreement or the HOA. And again, we don't really know the scale, but I think those would cover that. And I don't think that's that big of a deal to ask for that. I mean, I think part of that is we're looking for basic information that they actually have that structure and they're accountable. So I don't see that as a huge deal on an ask. And then we're going to have to trust them basically that they're going to fulfill that. I mean, like you would for any subdivision.
Okay. I'm not very trusting where those things are concerned, but okay.
Something that we wouldn't be able to resolve tonight, but just to throw it out there, something to consider, especially for these smaller ones that are unlikely to have a community building. Maybe it is just a cluster of 4. Again, don't know if you'd have the resources or the interest, but we could require that like native grass and native pollinator plants or what have to be used in the green space, because they are like zero. They're like zero maintenance once they're established. So like for the first year, you have to pull the weeds, and after that, they just do their thing and nobody has to do anything. So it would take a lift to be able to actually have like a prescribed like requirement made up. But at some point, perhaps in the distant future, it might be an option to help mitigate some of the long-term maintenance issues.
I mean, we could add some language to encourage it, but yeah, I think the reality is there's a wide variety of plants you could probably consider as, native or pollinators. And so I think if Canby doesn't already have a list of that, then yeah, we're trying to create a list.
Yeah,
So that,
the OSU
that
extension
becomes a bit of a
has
challenge. But yeah, I
specific
mean, maybe if
recommendations for
there's a
different areas.
reference that we, but again, I think the idea here is to provide flexibility in what they can do there, because maybe they do want something that is, English garden style.
right.
And so I don't necessarily encourage that format because I don't like arborvitae hedge, but
Sure,
I think it creates some flexibility.
So one other question I had too is that the units of these cottage clusters that face the street, we talked about those earlier. Do those fall in? Where do they fall into as far as if it's an undeveloped piece of land? They face the street. Do they need to put in the sidewalks and the street trees and everything that goes along with the other developments that are around them? Or are we going to have a big gap in our sidewalks where we have a cottage cluster that faces the street?
I think, connectivity pieces of this, I would presume that it's going to be like a normal development, and we would require them to connect. I mean, unless there's a phased product where there's maybe an interim delay in that connection because it's phased, I don't really see a reason why we would not require connectivity. There's a bunch of reasons actually for that. There are safe routes to school, there's ADA, there's a whole bunch of things that are going to apply here. So I don't really see a product or a situation where we would not require that.
Okay, so in reading this, does it extend to our requirements for that? So if I were a developer and I were coming in and I wanted to build a cottage cluster and I just did 20 of them in 20 different towns and Canby looks like it's ripe, and so I come in and I read this, is that something that you're just going to address in the pre-build conference? And he's going to say, well, it doesn't say anywhere in your code where you got to do that. So I'm not that anybody would ever do that to us, but we should have those things extend if they're going to be on a front-facing street.
So maybe just to back up a bit, it sounds like we're talking about frontage improvements, right? Making that street curb, gutter, sidewalk, landscape strip, all that to make the street complete. So this code section is not meant to supersede your standard street requirements that are housed elsewhere in your code. So I think to Don's point, this isn't meant to suggest that you can't apply that code section.
Okay, good. Just making sure we're trying to cover as many of our bases as we can here.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just to overlay this particular housing type over those codes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Jessica, great response. I mean, I was visualizing like, it would be probably a street connection, Commissioner Award. I mean, and we're not altering, again, we're not doing skinny streets. We're not doing anything beyond the standard required street width for that. And the expectation would be that they'd have to connect to the street system, and they would be doing exactly, that would be continuous. So it wouldn't be like, oh, there's a tiny sidewalk next to a big sidewalk. It would have to be continuous.
So along those lines, is everybody okay if we jump into page 4, the R1 low-density residential zone, red lines, changes, and just move through that quickly? Does anything jump off the page at them they want to throw a yellow penalty flag at right now?
Not for me, no.
Mr. Ewert?
I'm good for right now, thank you.
Okay. All right, so moving through. Okay, so that goes all the way to page, what was that? 11 of 31, and then page 12 of 31, we have the R 1.5 medium density residential zone changes. Does anybody have any heartburn with the suggestions there?
Are we going to be finishing that slide?
You can, but this does the same thing.
Okay, got it. No, not for me.
And it does say development standards, cottage cluster developments are exempt from these standards and are instead subject to the cottage cluster development and design standards. So again, it's just the overlay giving an explanation for if you build a cottage cluster, what's required in addition to. And I don't think there was anything, I didn't have anything that jumped off the page on the rest of those. Does anybody, any other commissioners have anything for 1.5? Mr. Ewert? Commissioner Llewellyn, anything for you? You've been quiet over there? Okay. Commissioner Driscoll, anything on 1.5?
Yep.
Okay. So then, if there's nothing on 1.5, I think we move to page 24 of 31, if I'm tracking correctly.
Correct.
Uses permitted. And again, I didn't have anything tagged under that one.
Nope.
No? Okay, just double checking with Mr. Ewert before we move to page 26.
I'm good.
Okay. Page 26, chapter 16.76, requirements. Whole lot of red there, so just double checking with everybody again. Any comments, concerns?
I've got something for page 27 in B.
27. Okay.
What was the recital again? I'm sorry.
Page 27, it's 1676, section B.
Section B, sorry. Okay,
No
thank you.
worries. The density bonus, that we can grant an increase of up to 20% beyond the maximum density of the underlying base zone if all these criteria are met. Does that density, right now, 35 foot is the tallest structure that is allowed in any of the zones. I would assume that could potentially be in question with an increase of the density, or is it, it still needs to meet all the other?
Yeah, building height
criteria?
would not be affected by density,
Okay.
at least not that I'm aware of.
No, it will, it will not be affected.
And if it were going to ever apply, it would have to be called out specifically here that it was allowable?
The whole discussion on building heights will not occur until next fall. I mean, that's one of those housing production strategy issues, and that has a whole gamut of issues with it, including fire access, parking. I mean, it's a big deal. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a big can of worms, to be honest with you, to go into height discussion. So there, you all will have that chance to input later, but this is not intended to address any of
Well,
that.
I think too, to maybe dispel any sort of concerns about it, density by definition is total number of units by acreage, right? So it really doesn't take into account heights, because we're not talking about a unit on floor 1 and a unit on floor 2. Like, that's not, because building height is just your total, you're talking about an individual housing unit, right? And its height at 35 feet.
Well, or anything, I mean, it could be,
But density, what I'm saying is like based on unit number, not a number of floors, because, you know what I'm saying?
sure, but I mean, if you're going to have more density, if instead of having 12 units on 3 levels, you have 16 units on 4 levels, I mean, that would be an increase in density if you're building up.
Right, but yes, but this is about total number of units that are changing, not what those units look like as far as building height. Like, this number is specifically about unit count. That's where the 20% is changing, not height.
Yeah, because you said heights off the table. I just
Yeah.
wanted to check.
Yeah, yeah.
Because depending on the criteria, I would assume that if when we go down the rabbit hole of height allowances, that this change would then potentially apply to height as well. If it changes in other sections of the code, then it would be on the table.
There's the exception on page 31 that says building height shall conform to the zoning district in which the development is located.
Yeah, so for now,
So,
nothing can be over
yeah.
35 because that's the rules. But if
Yes.
R2 ends up being 45 feet in 2 years.
Well, this is, okay.
This is
This applies to everything.
This is R1 and R15.
This is only R1.
R1 and R15 only, so PUDs, so we're not, R2 does not apply into PUDs, we're not addressing R2.
Sure, but chapter 16.76 is only R1 and 1.5?
It is, because if you look at the base zone, that R1 and R15, we've clearly articulated that only applies to those 2 zones. The revisions we're making in planned unit development is only related to R1 and R15.
Okay. The other zones are part of chapter 16 too, so I thought the requirements applied to others. That's my mistake.
Sorry, guys.
No worries. And there's a whole number of items later in next fall that we'll be tackling, which will be related to multifamily, and that's not really on the table tonight.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving
Matt,
through,
can I ask one more question?
I wish you would.
Okay. And on page 27 of 31, number 2, we're talking here in this little paragraph, Dawn, about, it says, however, common courtyards provided with a cottage cluster development per section 1621, yada, 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 as a part of a PUD may count towards the PUD's usable space requirement. So that verbiage in there, if they put a cottage cluster in the, as part of a development of a PUD, what that is saying is that the courtyard, open space that goes along with that cottage cluster counts towards the percentage of open space that we require for the PUD. Is that overall, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and I think that takes us right through to completion of all the changes, or I'm sorry, the different sections that had changes or additions to. So with that in mind, is there anything we need to circle back to that we haven't covered already?
No.
Mr. Ewert, any final thoughts on what we're seeing? No? Okay. So obviously a lot of recommendations have come out of here. So at this point, is this like, speak it now or forever hold your peace because it's going to go to council after this?
It will go to council for their approval. Our goal, and I'll be talking to Jessica, she's taking copious notes, I took
Yeah.
notes too. So we'll put all this together with the record tonight on your recommendations and those items that are still like where there was not plurality. We'll keynote those and the council will end up making that decision. The scheduled hearing is November 6th for that, so that's coming up. And then they would make that decision. They'd ask his planning commission to weigh in on this. That's probably going to be one of the bigger items, and we're going to say yes, and here's what their commentary is. We'll write a staff report and identify, in addition to all the process stuff that we have to go through, but just what your comments were in specific.
So will we get a chance to eyeball that by, is it too much to ask by the 28th before it goes to council for review? Because I would imagine we're going to have to adopt the meeting minutes anyway. So is that too soon, or do we think we can make that happen so that everybody has a chance to weigh in just to verify?
I think we could probably, what do you think, Jessica?
Yeah, I think we could provide our notes by early next week. I have a conference at the end of this week, I'm sorry, so, but I could get you
And I'm
something for
actually
sure by
At a
Monday.
conference, I'm speaking probably at the same conference she's going to,
Yeah.
so, on Thursday. But, I think next week.
Yeah, we could get it to you for next week.
I think we'll
Just
put
before the
comment
next
boxes and
meeting.
strike through, and then we'll put the ones out there that are like, these are still to be where we want the council's weighing in on this.
Okay.
On that. So, yeah, absolutely, we can send that
Thank you.
to the group. We will want responses back fairly quickly
Sure.
because of the hearing.
Would you want us, is it acceptable to give those responses at the October 28th meeting? Or is that too close to the November
I think
presentation?
we'd like to get the final, you're kind of, maybe, this is a little bit different here because like you're making a recommendation here, so you're not making the final decision. So the
Right.
final findings are a little bit weird. I mean, but I think this could be memorialized in the sense, I'm hoping at that October 28th meeting that our revisions would be your blessing of the final text.
Okay.
David, does that seem to jive with you?
Yeah, that makes sense now.
Okay. So, yeah, so we'll get it to you next week, and then we'll have you guys hopefully give us comments back fairly quickly, and then we'll hope to have that on the 28th. We do have a hearing item actually on the 28th as well.
Okay. Just making sure procedurally we're not running afoul of any quasi judicial.
Well, I don't think.
Legislated anyway, so you're fine.
Yeah, I think it's a good move, because, I mean, and I hope it's not like, we just can't continue this ongoing dialogues. We need some
yes.
finality, on this,
Right.
so that we can move it on, yeah.
Yep, understood. Okay, so at this point then, do we entertain a motion to close out this section of the,
I'd like you to make a motion to close this out, and with recommendations to come back, that staff will come back with the noted revisions, but
Yep.
that planning commission is in support of making a recommendation of approval. The final version of this will be coming back to planning commission for final findings on the 28th.
okay. So do we have a motion?
I move to do what Dawn said just now. You used a lot of words.
Is that your version of ditto?
Yeah.
Okay. And do we have a second?
I'll second that vague statement.
Okay. So by a roll call vote, starting with Vice Chair Ewert,
Yes.
Aye.
Commissioner Driscoll, Commissioner Welling, myself am aye.
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 All right, so the ayes have it. We approve our motion to do all the things that Dawn said, putting this thing forward to the October 28th for final review, and then the subsequent follow-on to push to commission. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your input, yeah. Really
And thank you,
appreciate it.
Jessica, for
Thank you,
guiding us through
everyone.
that
Yeah,
process as
absolutely.
well. The moment you've all been waiting for, items of interest, report from planning staff. Take it
And
away, Don.
I'll keep it fairly short. Well, we have an upcoming hearing on the 28th as well. I think it's for OLCC. I think that's the hearing Ryan is leading.
Oh, man.
And so that's coming up. And then we have another hearing in November for an annexation. So we're starting to get some hearings back in place as well. We will also have housing production strategies at the 28th of October. That'll be after the hearing. That will hopefully be a little less involved, than the code stuff. It's more guidance, but we'll be presenting that. We had a bit of good news. We were recipients of the Transportation Growth Management Grant from ODOT for conceptual planning for our comprehensive plan.
Great.
Anticipated that will be around $250,000 for that work, which is really good, and very pleased with that we were selected. So that would go into work. We'd start that work. Actually, the contracting is probably going to be about next summer, and then it'll continue for the 2 years. And concept planning is what you do after you do your urban growth boundary expansion. You do concept planning for infrastructure, roads, and utilities. You plan where those are going to go, what the financial costs of those are going to be, and come up with a plan so you have an executable plan. Then that becomes part of your comp plan, yet again re-adopted into your comprehensive plan with the new boundary, and the concept plan is part of that. So that was really nice to get that, and just marching forward on the housing stuff is kind of the big thing for this year, and then hopefully the comp plan will then kind of start taking off. We're in a bit of a holding pattern until the housing stuff is done, and then we'll be diving into the comprehensive plan next year for the current city limits and current urban growth boundary. That'll hopefully be adopted next summer. That's the current boundary, not the expansion boundary. And then the expansion boundary would happen after the urban growth boundary expansion application. Concept planning would have to occur as well. That's a couple years out. And then that boundary, urban growth boundary, would end up being expanded. So many steps. There'll be another community summit just for input, like general timeframe. Community summit probably in the early 2025 range. There's 2 summits next year. We have some advisory committee meetings next year as well for the comp plan. I'm not sure, I think there's 2 or 3. As I mentioned, we're going to do this ambitious code update as well, starting next year, probably next fall. Hopefully, we'll get that all budgeted with council. But council's pushing, it's long overdue, but that'll address many, many issues. If you have a desire to be on a committee for the code, let me know. That's not something that's going to happen for a while, but that would be an important position. Obviously, the Planning Commission will have a huge role, but we will likely have an advisory committee for both housing and possibly for employment as well. There may be 2. So that's on the horizon. And that's what I've got.
It's going to be a busy couple years for sure.
Yeah, there's
It's going to be
a
intense.
lot of, it's good. I mean, part of this, it's good to have these all overlap. It's very challenging to keep up with these, but it's good because you can kind of see the bigger picture of what's going on.
And so that grant, you mentioned that is going to fund a lot of the outside agency help.
It'll fund a big chunk of that. I mean, it's an incredibly expensive and long journey to do any urban growth boundary in Oregon. It's just, it's the process. I thought it'd be way shorter when I started this. But it's a very long journey to get, I mean, it's intentional and, but we're marching forward with those steps. So,
Great.
I mean, the good news, I think, in the broad scheme of things is it'll give us another 20 years of, employment land and residential land with the hope that that's enough and, meets all the other requirements.
All right. Thank you for that, Director Hardy. Items of interest and guidance from the Planning Commission. Anybody on the commission have anything?
I had an item of interest. I was curious, and you might not know the answer off the top of your head. Do we have any noise restrictions for commercial or industrial businesses?
That's another part of our code update that we probably will be needing to address. I mean, when Pioneer Industrial Park went in, there wasn't anything around that. The only real noise code issues that we have ability to control is when we condition applications and go through that process about operational hours. Our code is extremely liberal on noise for industrial areas. Basically, it doesn't really have much restriction at all. So the only thing we really have to go by is when industrial projects come through that we condition their operational hours if there is going to be a concern. And that's our code is extremely liberal. I'm not sure why. That was probably the most liberal noise ordinance I've seen in my career, but it makes sense when you have industrial to industrial, nobody really cares, but when you have residential to industrial, it's a big deal.
Yeah, and I was wondering if that's something we could deal with sooner rather than later. I'm kind of concerned. By now, probably everybody knows how loud the crypto farms are and all the data centers. And it was my impression we didn't have a lot of parameters around that. I don't know how much you know about like energy, but our rates from Canby Utility are less than a third of what you get from PG and Pacific Power. So sooner or later, we're cheap, there's land, we're trying to build, something like that's likely to come through. So if we're prepared with parameters that are going to work for the community, for anything that might want to come in, it would probably be to our advantage.
Are data centers something that we're looking at ever? Are we trying to court them?
Well,
Just out of curiosity.
I think there's a mixed bag there, and I'm not going to speak for CUB, for Canby Utility, but there's also the amount of electricity that CUB has actually secured and the need to actually expand that at some time, and the rates would end up, I understand, would go up if they bought more energy from Portland General Electric. So it's a fairly dynamic situation. I mean, I think for what we have in our growth right now, they have enough, but if we had these giant, I mean, it doesn't take much, is what I understand. Even a small like warehouse that's full of data center.
They're ridiculous
is a huge drain on the system.
Yep.
I mean, like what you see in the Dalles, those are incredibly large facilities that I can't even imagine what they're drawing, but they're enormous.
It's a big strain on the electrical grid
Right.
too, and not just the volume available, but just the underlying systems.
Failure and they set on fire.
Yeah.
Even more fun.
All right. I think at this point, then, we'll entertain a motion for adjourn.
I move that we adjourn the meeting of October 14th.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All against? No one. All right, the ayes have it. Thank you, Canby. We're done for the evening. See you next time. Bye, Mr. Ewert.